Sony Interactive Entertainment announced dozens of layoffs in their US and EU offices as a part of a massive restructuring. Announced the same day as the PlayStation 5 release date, Sony's restructuring plans are aimed at moving away from regional focuses and bringing the company's operations in line with a more centralized model. It was a big day of news, one which is telling about how Sony envision their future, and one that has more than a few people a little bit worried. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Industry Report, the series where we take a look at the most interesting stories in the games industry. Before we get started, be sure to like, sub, and ring that bell to let YouTube know that you are enjoying the content. And with that, let's talk about Sony. It certainly has been a busy time for them, with the company picking a random Tuesday in October to drop some of the biggest news of the year. So, Jim Ryan, Sony Interactive Entertainment CEO, and Mark Cerny, systems engineer, let Wired.com in on a few more details about their next console venture. Officially called the PlayStation 5, Sony's new console will release holiday 2020 in line with Microsoft's Project Scarlet. Now, the new system information here is that there is apparently fine-grained access to data, which likely just means that you can maybe save some space by only installing the multiplayer version of a game. Also, that ray tracing is supported on a hardware level, which is definitely good news, so not a software level, and changes to the new controller, which is presumably going to be called the DualShock 5. Newly implemented is haptic feedback. That's likely the largest feature here, as Sony set their sights on providing a uniquely immersive play experience. The revised gamepad also features adaptive triggers, which, by offering different levels of haptic feedback based on essentially how the triggers are pulled, and I suppose how a developer actually uses them, will give you a much more varied and tactile experience. The inclusion of a new controller speaker also ties in with the haptic feedback as a mixture of vibration and, well, vibrations that you can hear, also called sound, just bring an in-game environment to life in a more nuanced way than before. Ideal for competitive shooters? No. Ideal for games like The Last of Us? Yes. The pack for the investor relations actually sums this all up pretty nicely, what their goals are, outlining the PlayStation hope to harness the power of new technology to offer completely transformative and immersive gaming experiences. Now, saying completely is a bit much there, but there is actually potential here. Now, I've got to assume that this is more from the first-party studios, and they'll be the people to realize this, not the multi-platforms. Now, what I would say is a lot of people are going to be skeptical about those things. I would say, remember how people felt when the PS3's 6-axis controller removed vibration. They weren't too happy. And if you think about, say, even just using a modern phone, like I think especially the iPhones are good for this, using a HTC Vive controller, really many of the VR controllers, haptics are a major part of the experience, and it is you've got to use it to know it sort of thing. It can't really be communicated through a trailer or a press release. So that was the good news that was dropped last Tuesday, but the bad news is that Sony announced a number of layoffs. Now, these affected their offices around the world, but particularly those in the US and the EU. Now, the reason for these layoffs is related to Sony's ongoing restructuring plans, which have been in place since April 2019, and basically are an extension of the growing influence of PlayStation's North American arm, Sony Interactive Entertainment America. Now, basically here, their plan is to move away from Sony's traditionally more regional structure into a more centralized model. Now, that's something that I normally just think is a bad idea off the bat. I think decentralized command is the way forward, the way to do things. So typically, Sony's regional arms were able to act in a more autonomous fashion, authorizing their own games, even defining their own budgets. And this meant that the regional departments were afforded greater freedom in appealing to their own audiences, which of course they, as the regional departments, will know best. Now, this was handy for, say, marketing ideas to Europe that maybe wouldn't go so well over in the USA, and vice versa, and effectively allowed Sony to tap into markets that their more centralized competitors could not really touch in as effective a manner. Now, while beneficial for Sony, this regional strategy did mean that they had decently sort of disjointed group operations, something which is said to have frustrated a number of third-party publishers who were just tired of navigating the regional stepping stones, like between all the different offices. Now, the idea behind this ongoing restructuring was to essentially establish a more centralized hierarchy of governance and strategy, and this has basically seen SIEA, the American branch, have a lot more influence in the overall operations. Now, basically, their hope here was that the centralizing effort would establish a unified creative strategy across the board, while simultaneously allowing them to just maintain the element of regional autonomy that's proved so lucrative in the past. Essentially, they wanted to get the best of both worlds. Now, as Christopher Dring writes in his article for GameIndustry.biz, this new approach hasn't necessarily been working well for Sony. So the increasingly dominant influence of the American wing of Sony is, well, it's rumored to have been drawing a lot of criticism from the regional offices, who are now frustrated with this increased US oversight, overbearing governance, and a finicky sign-off procedure that basically is just a whole bunch of stuff they did not have to deal with previously. Now, while this is largely unconfirmed, there have been concerns among niche groups who have been experiencing additional censorship in games and are rightfully a bit fearful of losing access to some of their series in the future. And I mean, that being a top-down sort of edict is a bit rumory, but certainly the effects are very obvious when you look at the market, and Sony are taking a lot of flack for just some of the changes there, sort of aligning what a lot of people saw, with Sony to just being a more USA blockbuster-focused operation. Then Sony Interactive Entertainment Europe are also seeing a distinct erosion in their influence and purpose. A number of employees have gone on record with outlets such as VGC.com to express their concern as to the role that SIEE will play in the next console generation. Now, this is particularly striking given that the European wing had always been integral with the PlayStation business, even since the PS1 days. Allegedly, SIEA's influence has become so strong that employees in Europe were completely unaware of the USA's decision to formally announce the PS5. Now, this speaks to a profound absence in the kind of unified clarity of vision that Sony's restructuring was supposed to instill across the company, and Sony, well, they do seem to be suffering for it. A large part of the worry here is the impact of the increased American control over Sony's gaming efforts. We've seen niche audiences feel really quite left out. We've seen a noted de-emphasis on creative indies and a focus on big Western blockbusters. So it does seem like the increased influence of Jim Ryan, who's relatively new in his position, is nudging Sony in a more traditional American direction. And to be honest with you, I think that's bad, and I think that's something that is not really in line with most of the people who have enjoyed Sony's content. Now, while that is my personal opinion, the counter-argument could be that the PS5 expanded their influence, so being less niche is maybe the right thing for them to do as a business in terms of the content, but still, it does kind of make me sad. Now, also, and in line with fears, it was recently revealed that Sean Layden, the chairman of Sony Worldwide Studios, was actually set to depart the company after 30 plus years there. Layden's departure was announced via a PlayStation Twitter account tweet, and it carried suspiciously little fanfare considering Layden's long and distinguished career with Sony. As chairman, Layden had overseen some of Sony's greatest recent successes, such as being the face of the deal that brought Insomniac Games into the Sony first-party fold, and also giving PlayStation a blockbuster exclusive in Spider-Man. His departure was sudden and really quite uncelebrated, which is a bit wild considering his past, and it speaks to maybe something deeper going on within Sony's leadership and their vision for the future. Due to the nature of Layden's departure, as well as the general state of things, the rumor mill has of course been working overtime. Also, aside from Layden, SIE Japan Asia president and SIE Japan director Asushi Morita also departed his role with sudden immediate effect. Now, it is worth noting he was 60 years old. That is a pretty average retirement age in Japan, but it's just the suddenness of that kind of caught people off. So all of these layoffs, management shakeups, strained relationships, which have reportedly came about as part of this restructuring, have started to affect the public view of Sony as we're moving into the next generation. Then back in the rumor mill, it was kind of interesting. We had different news outlets reporting that a number of third-party developers expressed concern with the direction that Sony is taking and believe basically that the confusion brought on by the global restructuring will make the transition to the PS5 a bit more difficult for them. Then top of that, they also reported that they weren't receiving dev kits on time and that PlayStation were being generally uncommunicative. But still, these are just rumors, and some of them have been debunked, or at least we've seen conflicting evidence from other sources in a number of cases. The third-party complaints in particular are something that other media outlets have addressed, with some reporting that they have heard exactly the opposite from third-party sources, with those third-party sources being wholly confident in Sony's vision going into the next generation. Supposedly, this generation is actually going to start very strong on the software side, unlike the last generation. Once the 2020's early wave of blockbusters is over, we are apparently going to see the next-gen launch lineup coming out in force, and supposedly it's going to be quite strong. Now, it is worth remembering that Sony still are the console frontrunners here, so essentially they have everything to lose going into the next generation, and as such, they are going to be attracting more detractors than usual. With the PS4 being so successful, the transition to the PS5 certainly is going to be an interesting one. Each and every one of Sony's decisions is just going to be under increased scrutiny here, and the rumors of unrest in upper management as a result of this restructuring, they're only going to fuel the fires of conjecture. That being said, these layoffs are very real, with the unlucky employees being given their notice and the lucky employees being invited to re-interview for their jobs, which is pretty rough. In Europe, the most affected divisions are marketing and PR, while in the US, the creative services team have faced the most cuts. Now, the timing of the announcement has also drawn, well, stark criticism, with one former employee writing in Twitter that they hate that the news is going to be drowned out by the PS5 announcement, and that certainly is the case. It's like, we're going to have this big hit of bad news, what will we do? Announce the PS5 and it'll wipe it out. And it seems like that broadly has been successful for them. Perhaps the biggest thing we can take away from this story, though, is that for all the advantage they have going into the next console generation, Sony certainly do have a lot of uncertainty in their future. Their continued attempts to restructure without establishing a defined, global vision just seem like they could be creating issues. The US, Asia, and Europe are very different markets after all. They react to marketing in different ways, they have different tastes for games, and managing that while centralizing is going to be an issue for Sony going forward if they cannot establish that cohesive collaborative strategy. Certainly on paper they do have winners, everything from the new features going into the PS5 to the renewed focus on streaming with PS Now, which at least does seem to be the in vogue thing to do. It does speak to Sony having parts of a winning plan. It just remains to be seen whether they can bring that together across all fronts. For my personal perspective here, I'm worried about the lack of regional focus and the knock-on effects on, just what that will do to their approvals process, as an example, what that will do to content that comes out, what it'll do to niche content. I'm definitely worried about that. Now, when you actually look at the PS5, I think you could be onto a few winners there. I think that things like ray tracing are actually going to be really important going into the future. And funny enough, oh dear, I've forgotten his name. David Cage, that's it. Quantic Dream Man, right? He recently said, 4K, 8K doesn't matter. What really matters is new effects like lighting. And I just completely agree. Like, whether something is 4K or 8K, who cares? What can be used for art is lighting. I mean, just look at lighting and color in a movie and how much that elevates the experience. So seeing Sony do that, I think that's really good. As a big, as a big proponent of VR, and I really love VR games, the haptic feedback, even in my HTC Vive controller, it really does elevate experiences. And even just, using, say, like the touchpad on my laptop is entirely driven by haptics, and honestly, it's better. It's really good. So what that means is that for those big blockbusters, I mean, I'm really excited. I think that stuff could be really cool. I remember The Last of Us and Uncharted 4 very fondly, but that said, if that means less of a focus in indies, less of those sort of more unique niche titles that a lot of people loved on that platform, then yeah, I could be a bit worried about Sony's future. And generally seeing the USA side of things get bigger, I mean, that does worry me a bit, because certainly US corporate culture applied across gaming, that's what gives us EA games. And there's certainly a lot of things there that a lot of people don't like that much. And I'd be sad to see Sony have those influences creep in. But anyway, there's the story. There's my take. I'd love to know what you think about this. Let me know down below. Thank you very much for watching this video. And with that, I will see you next time.